This was the unpublished paper by Friedrich Nietzsche, which came after his first book called The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1871. Now, in The Birth of Tragedy, if I may just quickly remind you, Nietzsche talks about two parallel ways of our existence, one being rational existence, another one being passionate, emotional existence. So by using the metaphors in Apollonian and Dionysian, Nietzsche is trying to bring us to the conclusion that we are not purely rational, but we are also passionate and emotional creatures. That idea never left Nietzsche, so he paid as much attention to human passionate side through Dionysus as a metaphor, god of wine and sexual frenzy, and also paid attention to the rational side, which he used through the metaphor of Apollo, god of light, god of knowledge, of art. So what that has to do with language? Well, following that train of thought, Nietzsche writes another paper, Truth and Lies in Non-Moral Sense. And in that paper, Nietzsche focuses mainly on language. For unknown reason to us, he did not publish that paper. Maybe he thought that the paper wasn't perfect, but he uses a lot of those conclusions and thoughts from the Truth and Lies in Non-Moral Sense later on. He uses them in Gay Science and also in the Beyond Good and Evil. So those books are also they contain a lot of paragraphs from Truth and Lies in Non-Moral Sense, which I wish you read. It's only like 20 pages paper, and you can download freely for free from internet. So what are his ideas about language and truth and words in this paper? He argues that language is not really objective reflection of reality, that we use language actually for some different reasons. We are not really concerned about the truth, but there are different reasons why we use language. And he's very sarcastic about our belief that our knowledge is the ultimate knowledge in the universe, because we believe, as Nietzsche says, wrongly, that we are capable of discovering the truth of the world, the truth in itself, which, as he mentions later on, great minds of Kant and Schopenhauer have proven that that is not possible. Kant talking about noumenon and Schopenhauer talking about the will. So there is no way that we can understand the essence of the world. We can only understand what we can experience. So phenomenon, but not the noumenon. And our belief in some absolute knowledge about everything is simply unsustainable. So he starts his paper by saying, once upon a time, in some remote corner of the universe, there was a planet where clever beasts invented knowledge. And he says that was the most arrogant moment in the history of the world. Arrogant a minute. But he says it was only a minute. It lasted only as long as the universe took a breath and then exhaled. And then the planet started cooling off and congealed. And the clever beast had to die. He wants to say how irrelevant human knowledge is in the universe. But he says, if we can communicate, we believe in that knowledge as the whole axis of the universe are actually orbiting around us. But he said, if we can communicate with an insect, we will understand that the insect also believes that the whole universe is actually rotating around them, and they are in the center of the universe. So he said, whose judgment of the validity of that knowledge is right and whose is wrong? He says we don't have the measure for that, because whoever would be able to measure it, it will have to be outside the universe. And such a measure doesn't exist. So it's just highlights in the beginning of the paper how arbitrary our knowledge is. He goes further to say that the words ultimately become concepts. And concepts are literally putting the masses of unequal things together and making them equal. What it means? That means that if you take, for example, a concept leaf, when we say a leaf, we all have a picture of a leaf in our mind. But that picture of our leaf doesn't exist in nature. There are billions and billions of different leaves in nature. Green, yellow, brown, small, big, long, narrow, thick, flat. But when we say leaf, we literally eliminate all these individual qualities. So we put all these unequal things, we made them equal. He wants to say how arbitrary words are and concepts. He says we decide we group animals into mammals. For example, we look at the giraffe and we say, oh, this is giraffe. I mean, it's not a giraffe. We are calling it giraffe, and we say it's a mammal. Giraffe doesn't know that it's a mammal. But this arbitrariness is something that Nietzsche is trying to point out throughout the essay. And then he goes further. He says, what is a word? He says it's a copy in sound of a nerve impulse. And if language and words were really representation of the objects as they are, Nietzsche says, then there would be not so many languages next to each other. Chair would be chair, and that's it. But every other language is calling that object in different name. So words are clearly arbitrary. So he calls concepts metaphors, and he says, to begin with, a nerve stimulus is transferred into an image. This is the first metaphor. And then that image gets a sound in a word, and this is the second metaphor. So it's not even direct metaphor of the object, it's the second metaphor. So that arbitrariness just deepens further down and goes on and on. So he's again trying to say, well, the world as it is, but we are using language and we are using names completely arbitrary for different purposes. We are not interested in the truth. We can't explain what things are. We just call them for different reasons, simply for utility. So we can organize things, world around us, and organize ourselves. And then when he talks about truths, he said, what then is the truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In a short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred and embellished, and which after a long usage seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. So even the truths are not something that is really true. They are illusions. He says truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force. So as you can see, for Nietzsche, language is not interested in truth. It's not really representing things as they are. Language is very arbitrary. And he says that because apart from things that we can talk about, there are things that we cannot talk about. And these are our aesthetic experiences, which are for him more important than our rational understanding of the world. So language has its use, but it's like a double-edged sword. We should be very clear about the ability of the language to represent the truth. I know it sounds quite perplexing, but he goes further into gay science and talks about consciousness as well, which takes him to conclude that we simply lack the organ for knowledge, the thinking itself, for truth. We know or believe or imagine just as much as may be useful in the interest of human herd, the species. And even what is here called utility is ultimately a mere belief, something imaginary, and perhaps precisely the most calamitous stupidity of which we shall perish one day. So the reduction of complexity of nature and items which are pregnant with details, with quality, this is what we do when we create concept. Nietzsche has considered the language inherently metaphorical, and this is why for him, especially in the gay science, if you read that book, you will see how important art is, because art communicates without language. Art sends us different messages, and is more important actually that we have ever envisaged. And this is why we have art. So he says that language serves human needs, not truth. And the limits of language are, for Nietzsche, inability to present us with something which cannot be spoken. And this is our inner states, our emotions, our passions, our instincts. So we can't talk about it. Our aesthetic experiences. It's very difficult to talk about it. So language has its use, but is not omnipotent. You will see when I mention Wittgenstein, there are a lot of overlapping ideas, and all the scholars are not very clear on Nietzsche's influence on Wittgenstein, simply because Wittgenstein never mentioned any influence, but I believe that he was very much influenced by Nietzsche, and you will see why. And some brave scholars would say maybe not directly, but indirectly, but I think it was direct influence. And I will mention that when I turn to Wittgenstein. So I hope you got a message of Nietzsche's view on language and inability of language to represent things which are for him of higher value for us. This is the limit of language. Now, Wittgenstein has been understood as one of the most celebrated and most important philosophers of 20th century, especially because of his book, which is called Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in 1921 in German and 1922 in English. Wittgenstein was a very peculiar personality. He was literally going from one extreme into another. He had a very turbulent private life, and he never had a degree in philosophy. He started studying for 2 years in 1912, and then in 1914 voluntarily joined the Austro-Hungarian army and went to war, which he spent 4 years, and he was even awarded the medals for extreme bravery. In 1912, his lover, Princeton, wrote about Wittgenstein. He expresses the most naive surprise that all the philosophers he once worshipped in ignorance are after all stupid and dishonest and make disgusting mistakes. So this is Wittgenstein for you to start with. This is his view of the whole history of philosophy in front of him. So they're all wrong. They all made mistakes and they're all stupid. So he says, I'm going to change all this. I'm going to change the history of philosophy. And I will prove why they were wrong. And he tried to do that in the Tractatus. A lot of people believe that he was very successful at it. And he himself believed that he is finished and finished with all problems in philosophy with that book, Tractatus. after he finished the book, he said, there is nothing else I can do. And he abandoned philosophy. He became a gardener, architect, teacher, and later on in life, he went back to Cambridge, and because of extreme importance and quality of tractatus, then Russell and Moore, who were the heads of the department of philosophy department in Cambridge, accepted tractatus as a PhD dissertation. So Wittgenstein, not even having a degree in philosophy, was awarded an opportunity to go for a PhD just because of the book he wrote. So he defended successfully the book, the thesis, and after Russell and Moore congratulated him, he stood up, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Don't worry, I know you will never understand it." That's Wittgenstein for you, right? And Russell answered, "Never mind, we like it and it's good." So he was so passionate about everything he did. And then he actually taught philosophy for not for long in Cambridge, and left that as well. He just couldn't, he was very upset with his students because they didn't understand what he was talking most of the time. So he would sometimes throw chairs on them, slap them, or it's unimaginable in these days. But in those days, and she just gave up. He just couldn't do it because he thought that nobody can understand him. Now, what made this tractatus so famous? What did he say? What is this all about? Why was the world so influenced by Tractatus Logico Philosophicus? I don't know if you ever had an opportunity to hold this book. It's not a very big book, it's about 70 pages. But it's very, very dry. I mean, I can summarize the book in 2 sentences, but it's got 70 pages, right? And it talks a lot about logic, it talks about nature of language. He's very much interested in logical structure of language. And he influenced that famous analytic philosophy, which was and is still popular in UK, not as much in Europe, which is more continental philosophy, or you can call it normative philosophy. I don't want to say more interesting, but anyhow. Yeah, his book is made of 7 propositions. And the first proposition states that the world is everything that is the case. The world consists of facts, not things. A fact is existence of state of affairs. So he wants to be rational, he wants to be logical, he wants to be extremely scientific, but the sentence that the first proposition is very questionable. The world is everything that is the case. They implicitly suggest that there will be no world without us humans. Because who created the case? So it's not dualistic approach. This is the world, objective world, and this is us humans. No, it's one. Very similar to Dasein, if you remember a lecture on Heidegger. So world is everything that is the case. The world consists of facts, not things. So we have here human being as a judge. If this is logical, then fine, but it may not be. So reading this kind of books, you have to be very Wittgensteinian, and you will see why. A state of affairs is a specific arrangement of objects in the world. Now, regarding objects, the structure of the world is mirrored in the structure of language. The logical picture of the fact is the thought. Thoughts are pictures of reality. So remember that word, pictures. Very important. Pictures of reality. And language is the medium through which those pictures are expressed. Sentences correspond to facts in the world. They are meaningful if they depict a possible state of affairs. So what are we having here is very heavy claim that thought is the picture of reality, right? So why is Wittgenstein going slowly, building his theory literally like brick by brick? He's going somewhere. He wants to prove something. And he wants to prove that all philosophers were wrong. And he's building his argument slowly. So he's taking us, and one of the most important pillars that support the whole construction is that idea that thoughts are pictures of reality. Remember that. Logic is the mirror of the world. And we know what is the world. World is everything that is the fact. So logic is the mirror of the world. Now the limits of language. Slowly he comes to an end. This is his sixth proposition. And he says that the limits of my language is the limit of my world. The limits of my language is the limit of my world. Language can only describe what can be pictured or represented. Anything outside this, such as ethics, metaphysics, or the meaning of life, is beyond language and cannot be meaningfully discussed. Very heavy claim, right? Very difficult to defend. He says attempts to speak about these things result in nonsensical propositions because they lie outside the logical structure of language. So he has created the web in which only he can act. And all other philosophers throughout history cannot. Attempts to speak about these things, which things? Ethics, metaphysics, aesthetics, result in nonsensical propositions because they lie outside the logical structure of language. And then he resolutely concludes and he says, what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. And with this sentence, he thinks that he has finished with all the problems of philosophy. So basically, what this book gives us is a picture theory of language. Picture theory of language. So if you cannot picture something, you can't talk about it. And he said in the beginning of before he started writing tractatus, he was apparently inspired by some court case in Paris, which was about some traffic accident, and the judges couldn't bring a decision, so they asked lawyers to bring models of the cars. And then Wittgenstein thought, this is the reason, this is how we think. We need pictures, we need models. And this was inspirational for him to start thinking about language as a picture theory of language. So he said, we speak in pictures. When somebody speaks to you, we speak in pictures. We see those things. And what we see, we give a name. So if there is no picture there, it's nonsensical. We can't give the name to it. And this is where he puts the most important philosophical disciplines like ethics or aesthetics or metaphysics. However, he comes back to philosophy after his experience of gardening, teaching in elementary schools and building the house of his beloved sister, being an architect. He comes back to philosophy and starts writing again. So what do you think he writes this time and what he says this time? Whatever he wrote wasn't published until during his lifetime. It's posthumously in 1953. And a collection of his writings is called Philosophical Investigations. Very rarely, I can't remember if ever that happened, maybe with Heidegger on his term, a philosopher criticizes his own work, especially something that made him so famous and granted him a PhD in Cambridge. So in the preface of Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein says the following: "For since beginning to occupy myself with philosophy again, 16 years ago, I have been forced to recognize grave mistakes in what I wrote in the first book." So he recognized his own mistakes in the book that made him famous, that influenced so many other philosophers. Was one of the precursors of analytic philosophy, as we know now. So he criticizes in this book Augustinian theory, his ostensive definition of language is the language that words are representing objects, but at the same time he criticizing himself and his theory of language picture theory. So he realizes that is not valid, doesn't hold. And that impetus that he had in the beginning when he was writing Tractatus, when he wanted to show the world that all these philosophers were wrong, pushed him very, very hard to create the book that was extremely influential. But later on he finds out that is not the real answer to philosophy. There is more to it. There is more to it. There are things that we can speak about, although if they are not objects and we don't have pictures of those things. We speak about Superman. It doesn't exist. We speak about God. It doesn't exist. We speak about love. It doesn't exist. So how can we speak about these things? Are they meaningless? Are they nonsensical? No, they are extremely meaningful, and they are extremely pregnant with sense. So he realizes that, and he realizes that his theory wasn't as powerful as he thought it was in his younger days. He introduces something that he calls language games. He goes a bit further, as Nietzsche did. So we are coming to that influence, which was apparently non-existing or indirect, but it's clear that it was very direct. He is turning that way as he goes into the waters in which Nietzsche was feeling very comfortable. And he says that language is a public tool for understanding of private life. The task of philosophy is to show the fly the way out of the bottle. Language meaning bottle. Now he says that bewitchment of philosophical problems actually arise from philosophers' misguided attempts to consider the meaning of words independently of their context, usage and grammar. This is exactly what Nietzsche was saying earlier. So, for example, he mentions Socrates. Socrates talks about justice in many dialogues, and he always asks for the definition of justice. And justice is not an object. It's not a material object. We can have a definition of a glass or a chair or something which we can dissect into atoms and know exactly what they are. But now he uses different terminology, different phenomena. He asks about justice. And nobody can give him definition of justice because it simply cannot be a definition of justice. Because justice is different, not only horizontally in different societies, but can only be different vertically through time. So this is why Socrates always finds the way to argue against any attempt to give a definition. And this is what Wittgenstein is trying to tell us, that actually if the words are taken out of the context of the particular group or community, it's very difficult to explain them. So words, language, are to be understood as the language games. So what that means? That means that every community, every nation has their own rules of the games. Those rules are not just in definitions, but they are also in judgments. And this is why Wittgenstein says, when somebody comes and talks your language from different country, he knows your language, but you can't understand him. Neither he can understand you. He can't understand that fabric of culture. Because when we speak particular group or people, we have different sense of humor, we talk differently. So if somebody comes from a different group, different culture, learns the same language as we speak, he will always be foreign because he cannot grasp that community, that game. Now the rules of the game, for example, when you say checkmate, you know immediately that applies to chess. You have different rules for poker or something. So every group, every nation, every game has different rules. So now he start talking about language games. Now the problem is, he says, when we try to generalize, we try to give a definition of the game, universal game. He says that is impossible. But what is possible is to understand that all of them, they are overlapping. They have something similar. So he calls that family resemblance when it comes to language. And he gives an example that in one family you can have different individuals. They're similar to each other. Some individuals have the same nose or eyes or facial expressions or height or whatever, but they are not the same. So it's very difficult, he says, to try to generalize. Now we are going back to concepts and Nietzsche again. In the first part, when I explain about his theory of concepts. And that brings him to say, do not think, look. He wants to say, don't just think about meaning. Look around. See how people communicate, what they're all about. So that's a very interesting point. And then he comes to the final, which I see direct influence on Nietzsche on him, when he says that we must do away with all explanation. In Tractatus, everything was explained, surgically, precise. And now we must do away with all explanation, and description alone must take its place. Description. So this is another thing that you can ask, discuss. What is the explanation and what is description? There are things that we can explain. We can explain very well, for example in science. But there are things that we cannot explain. So we should not try to attempt to explain. We should not think, we should look. We should express. We should describe. As Nietzsche said, we don't have an organ for knowledge. We can't explain everything. He argues again against private language. And this is an attempt to justify individual language. So when you have certain emotions or inspirations or motivation or whatever, and you think that what you say is going to be your way of saying it, therefore you can claim that this is your own private language, he says no, there cannot be, language cannot be private. Because if you have 7 people with boxes and everybody has a beetle in the box, and everybody thinks there is something in there, at the end, they will all agree they have a building box. So you have to communicate. Language is the communication, is the tool that helps us to express our private life into community. So it cannot be private language. Also, addressing the Cartesian soul, it's something which is completely subjective, individual, unexplainable, whatever. So he is against that essentialism as well. But so now all of a sudden the meaning of a word is its use in the language. So the meaning of the word is not a picture anymore, now is a use in language. But this has consequences, because this claim immediately suggests that the meaning of the world is instrumental. It's not a picture, it's use in the language. What language? In different languages, it's going to be different use. When we speak, for example, humor, jokes, you know, you may say a joke for some nation, they're just going to look at you and say, really, this is funny? They don't understand that, because in their language, this is completely different structure, and words are completely different meaning. As for example, Michael McIntyre says, the comedian, says how Americans call horse riding. They call it back horse riding. Understand? We call it payment, they call sidewalk. This is different game. And it's all around us. So this is why he says, don't think, look. So if you are in certain community, you know, when in Rome, do what Romans do. This is more or less that kind of sense. So I presented you with Nietzsche's view on language. I know it's quite complicated, but we are here to discuss that. And also Wittgenstein and his two parts, tractatus and then philosophical investigations, and the difference between first and second part. So he was brave enough to criticize himself, and he wasn't happy with the first part. That doesn't happen often. And I think in the second part, in philosophical investigation, he was more, if I may say, realistic, and he was more in terms of utility of language, rather than just being obsessed with the extreme surgical precision of logic within syntaxes, as he was in Tractatus. But Tractatus also is not useless, is very important, because they're part of language and reality, which exactly function as he said it. When, for example, builders talk between themselves, one says to another, hammer. The other guy is not going to start thinking of hammer in our language, what it can be. No, he takes the hammer and gives it to him. So there are different levels of language and different depths in which the first part, Tractatus, has actually related, I believe, successfully. But it wasn't applicable to every single level of language, especially of those areas which he even avoided later on to talk about, and this is aesthetics, ethics, and metaphysics. For him, that was difficult. He could ignore it in the first part, but he didn't explain it in the next one. So that much from me, and now please feel free to ask and discuss. Thank you.